The autumn wind whispered through the pines as I pulled up to the cabin. My headlights caught the reflection of Lake Champlain, dark and still against the twilight sky. I'd been away 3 years, 3 years of grief and silence. But something was wrong. Lights glowed in windows that should have been dark. When I opened the door, a man I'd never seen before stood in my living room, looking at me with confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if I were the intruder in my own home. Let me tell you how I came to this moment. My name is Vivian Matthews. For 68 years, I've lived a life that most would call ordinary. 42 of those years were spent with Walter, my husband, who passed away last winter. Cancer took his body, but something else, a truth only I knew, had already stolen his spirit long before. I remember the day I decided to return to the cabin. The maple trees outside my Burlington apartment had turned crimson and gold, and the morning light filtered through them like stained glass. Walter and I had purchased that lakeside retreat 26 years ago, a place where we could escape the noise of everyday life. The last time I'd been there was with him, before everything fell apart. The cabin held memories like treasures in a chest. Summer evenings on the deck, grandchildren running across the lawn, Walter teaching our grandson to fish. I needed to reclaim those memories, to touch the walls that had witnessed our happiness. Perhaps then I could finally let go. I packed a small suitcase, clothes for a week, Walter's old sweater, a book I'd been meaning to read. My arthritis made my fingers clumsy as I locked the apartment door behind me. The drive from Burlington took just under an hour, winding roads carrying me past farms and forests, the landscape growing wilder as I approached the lake. The scent of pine and damp earth greeted me like an old friend as I parked beside the cabin. My joints ached as I stepped from the car, the cool evening air seeping through my coat. That's when I noticed the lights and a blue sedan I didn't recognize in the driveway. Perhaps it was the caretakers, I thought. I'd hired a local company to check on the property occasionally. I took my suitcase from the trunk and made my way up the stone path. The key turned in the lock just as it always had, but when the door swung open, I found myself staring at a stranger. He was tall and silver-haired, perhaps in his early 60s, wearing reading glasses and a flannel shirt. Behind him, my cabin had been transformed, different furniture, unfamiliar paintings on the walls, the smell of beef stew simmering on the stove. "Can I help you?" he asked again, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. A woman appeared behind him, drying her hands on an apron. "Who is it, Richard?" I stood frozen in the doorway, my suitcase heavy in my hand. "This is my cabin," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Vivian Matthews." The couple exchanged glances. The woman, petite with kind eyes and graying brown hair, stepped forward. "There must be some mistake. We purchased this property nearly 2 years ago. We have all the documentation." Richard, 62, and Nancy, 59. A couple from Burlington living in my cabin for almost 2 years. "We bought it from Theodore Bennett," Nancy continued nervously. "Your representative," he said. "We have all the papers." Theodore Bennett. The name hit my chest like a stone. Walter's trusted attorney and friend for decades. The man who had managed our affairs, who had sat at our dinner table countless times, who had held my hand at Walter's funeral. That night, I slept in a hotel room in Burlington, tears drying on my face. The walls seemed to close in around me as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, my mind racing. How could my cabin have been sold without my knowledge? How could Theodore have betrayed us this way? Morning light streamed through thin curtains as I dressed, my hands trembling slightly. I drove to the law firm where Theodore had worked for 30 years, a prestigious practice in downtown Burlington. The receptionist's eyes widened when I gave my name. "Mrs. Matthews," she said, "we haven't heard from you since the incident with your son." My son, Henry, 46 years old, a university professor with my eyes and Walter's stubborn chin. His name rarely crossed my lips these days. The shame was too great. Theodore had retired 18 months earlier, they told me. His secretary, Abigail, a woman in her early 40s with compassionate eyes, looked at me with pity. "We can pull the records of your properties," she offered. Perhaps there was some confusion. In those records lay the first revelation. Not just the cabin, but 3 other properties Walter and I had owned had been sold. All the money transferred to an account I'd never heard of. The signature on the documents was mine. Perfect. Identical. Forged. When I returned to the hotel that evening, a package awaited me at the front desk. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. The truth Walter never had the courage to tell. No signature. The contents were emails between Theodore and Walter from 3 years ago. They spoke of securing Henry's future and protecting Vivian from the truth. My hands grew cold as I read them, each word another crack in the foundation of my life. I called my daughter, Lauren, 43, living in Madison with her children, Emily, 15, and Jason, 12. Her husband, Derek, had never hidden his dislike for me. Lauren and I hadn't spoken frequently since the conflict with Henry. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. "Mom?" Her voice held disbelief. "Is that really you?" "Of course it's me," I said, confused by her reaction. "You disappeared. We tried to find you for months. Dad said you asked for space, that you were traveling the world. Then, when he got sick, he said you didn't want to see anyone." The shock left me breathless. I hadn't disappeared. I'd been caring for Walter, or at least that's what I thought I had been doing. Lauren arrived 2 days later. We embraced in the hotel lobby, both holding back tears. She looked older, with strands of gray in her hair that hadn't been there the last time I saw her. "What really happened that night with Henry?" she asked after hours of conversation. Dad never fully explained. The memory returned, painful as an open wound. Henry, our brilliant son, discovered misappropriating research funds. Walter, determined to protect him. Me, insistent that he face the consequences. The terrible argument. Henry shouting that I never truly loved him. Walter, between us, pleading for calm. Then Henry revealing, "She's not who you think she is, Dad. Ask her about Raymond." Raymond Miller, 72. My first love. Before Walter. A secret buried for decades. Lauren and I investigated for weeks. We discovered Theodore had created an elaborate narrative. I, devastated by the revelation of an old secret, had abandoned Walter. In reality, Theodore and Henry had completely isolated me, intercepting calls, forging emails, manipulating Walter as his mental health began to fail. "I don't understand why Henry would do this," Lauren said as we reviewed documents in my small hotel room. The second revelation came when we visited our old neighbor, Gerald, 75. He embraced me, shocked to see me alive. "Vivian? My God, you're alive. Walter said you died in an accident in Europe." My own obituary had been shown to friends and neighbors, a cruel fabrication while I lived in isolation, caring for an increasingly confused Walter, who alternated between recognizing me and treating me like a hired nurse. We decided to confront Henry. He taught at the university in Burlington, the reason Walter and I had initially bought the cabin, to be near him. I found him on campus, thinner than I remembered, with deep circles under his eyes. "Mom," he whispered when he saw me, as if seeing a ghost. At a cafe near campus, the truth emerged in painful fragments. Henry hadn't misappropriated any money. The accusation was fabricated by Theodore, who had been blackmailing my son for years. "He had documents about Dad, about you, about Raymond," Henry confessed. Raymond Miller wasn't just my youthful boyfriend. He was Henry's biological father, a secret I had carried for decades, hidden even from Walter. Theodore, who had always harbored feelings for me, discovered this and used it as a weapon. "He said he would destroy Dad, reveal everything, ruin our family if I didn't cooperate," Henry explained, tears in his eyes. "Then he started selling everything, one property at a time. When I realized what was really happening, I tried to stop him. That's when he invented the story that you had abandoned Dad." Winter came to Burlington. With the help of a new attorney, Caroline Stevens, 53, a determined and incisive woman, we recovered part of what was lost. Theodore had fled to Mexico, taking millions with him. Richard and Nancy, the couple in the cabin, were victims too, innocent buyers of fraudulently sold property. On a frigid January afternoon, Caroline called me to her office. She had found something in Walter's personal safe deposit box at the bank. "He left this for you," she said, handing me an envelope. Instructions for it to be delivered after his death. Inside was a letter written in Walter's shaky handwriting, dated 2 weeks before he passed away. "My dearest Vivian, I am coming back to myself in these final moments. The confusion is lifting, and I now clearly see what happened. Theodore is not who we thought. I discovered his manipulations too late. Henry tried to warn me, but I didn't understand until now. There's something you need to know. I always knew about Henry, from the beginning. Raymond told me before he died 15 years ago. I never said anything because it didn't matter. Henry was always my son, in every way that truly counts. Forgive me for not being strong enough to protect you. Forgive Henry, who only tried to protect us." In the bottom drawer of the desk at the cabin, if it still exists, there is a secret compartment. There you'll find the final proof against Theodore. With all my love, forever, Walter. In spring, we returned to the cabin. Richard and Nancy invited us in. We were almost friends now, united by common betrayal. The desk was still there, sold along with the house. In the secret compartment, we found recordings, Theodore confessing everything to Walter, believing my husband was too confused to understand or remember. The proof we needed to seek justice. Lauren remained by my side. Henry, after months of therapy, began rebuilding his life. Emily and Jason, my grandchildren, started calling me Grandma again. Richard and Nancy invited us to spend a weekend at the cabin, now legally theirs. It was strange but also healing to see the place take on new life. Nancy had planted daisies in the garden, my favorite flowers, without knowing. One July morning, sitting on the deck overlooking Lake Champlain, Henry joined me. We sat in silence for a long time. "Did you know Dad used to take me fishing here every summer?" he finally said, even after he knew the truth. Nothing ever changed between us. "Walter was always your father," I replied, holding his hand. That night, we shared stories with Richard and Nancy, memories of the cabin, of Walter, of lives intertwined by fate. I laughed for the first time in years, genuinely. Caroline managed to locate Theodore. He would face justice. The money, much of it, was recovered. But some things, I learned, cannot be recovered. Some need to be rebuilt from scratch. Today, I am 70 years old. I live in a small apartment in Burlington, close to Henry and my new friends, Richard and Nancy. Lauren visits frequently with the children. I no longer have the cabin, but I have something more valuable: the truth and my family back. Sometimes when the wind blows from the lake, I think of Walter. How even at the end, he found strength to leave one last gift, the chance for rebuilding. And I realized that sometimes we lose everything to discover what truly matters. The cabin is no longer mine, but the memories, the real ones, those that no one can forge or steal, those will always be mine. And now, finally, I can share them again. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after losing what you thought was your foundation? Sometimes the things we lose make room for what we truly need to find. 7 months after discovering the truth about Theodore's betrayal, I sat in Caroline's office as she handed me a thick folder of legal documents. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between us. "It's over, Vivian," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "The court has ruled in your favor. Theodore has been extradited from Mexico and will face multiple charges of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse." I nodded, running my fingers over the embossed seal on the judgment papers. Victory should have felt sweeter, but instead I felt hollow. No legal decision could restore the 3 years stolen from me. 3 years when friends thought I was dead, when my family was fractured, when Walter died believing I had abandoned him. "What about the money?" I asked, though it mattered less to me now than it once had. Caroline adjusted her glasses, a habit I'd noticed when she was delivering complicated news. "We've recovered about 60%. The rest," she shrugged, "spent or hidden where even the best forensic accountants can't trace it." "And the properties?" "The court acknowledges they were fraudulently sold, but the current owners purchased them in good faith. Legally, they're protected." She leaned forward. I'm sorry about the cabin, Vivian. I thought of Richard and Nancy, how they'd welcomed me into what was once my home, how they'd planted daisies without knowing they were my favorite. Sometimes life has a strange way of bringing healing through unexpected channels. The cabin is where it needs to be, I said. Later that day, I met Henry at our favorite cafe near the university. The spring semester was ending, and students hurried past the windows, their faces bright with the promise of summer. My son looked better than he had in months. The haunted look in his eyes had faded, replaced by something approaching peace. "I've been offered a position at Madison," he said after we ordered. "Chair of the economics department." "Madison," I repeated. "Where Lauren lives." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Emily and Jason need their uncle around, and I think—" He paused, stirring his coffee unnecessarily. "I think we all need to be closer." I reached across the table and took his hand. It was warm and solid and mine, so, like Walter's, that my heart ached with the memory. "What about you, Mom? Have you thought about what's next?" The question had been circling in my mind for weeks. My apartment in Burlington felt temporary, a way station rather than a home. I had been living in limbo, waiting for the legal proceedings to conclude before making any decisions. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "This place holds so many memories now, good and bad." "Lauren mentioned there's a small house for sale on her street," Henry said, his tone carefully casual. 3 bedrooms, a garden, walking distance to the kids' school. I looked out the window at Burlington, the city where Walter and I had built our life together, where we had raised our children, where I had lost and found myself again. Could I leave it behind? "I'll think about it," I promised. That evening, I walked along the shore of Lake Champlain. The water lapped gently at the rocks, a soothing rhythm that matched my footsteps. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I thought about Walter, about the letter he'd left me, about how even in his confusion he had found clarity at the end. I thought about Henry, carrying the burden of a secret that wasn't his to bear, about Lauren, who had believed her mother had abandoned the family, yet still welcomed me back with open arms, about my grandchildren, who had lost years with their grandmother that could never be reclaimed. And I thought about Theodore, the man who had sat at our dinner table, who had advised Walter on investments, who had been trusted with our most private affairs. What drives a person to such betrayal? Was it greed or something more personal? His infatuation with me had been obvious to everyone except Walter, who saw only the good in people. Had rejection twisted into revenge over decades? These questions would likely never be answered. Theodore had refused to speak since his extradition, maintaining a stubborn silence that denied us even the small comfort of understanding. 2 weeks later, I drove to the cabin. Richard and Nancy had invited me for lunch, a standing invitation they extended whenever I felt the need to visit. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed changes to the property. They had painted the shutters a deep green instead of the blue Walter had chosen. A new dock extended into the lake, with 2 Adirondack chairs facing the water. Nancy met me at the door, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "Vivian, perfect timing. The bread just came out of the oven." Inside, the cabin smelled of freshly baked sourdough and herbs. Richard was setting the table, 3 places with the everyday stoneware they preferred to fine china. "How are you holding up?" he asked as he poured iced tea into glasses. "Caroline told us about the court decision." "I'm taking it day by day," I said, accepting the glass he offered. "Some days are easier than others." We ate on the deck, the lake stretching before us like a sheet of glass. Nancy had prepared a simple meal: bread, salad from their garden, and a quiche with vegetables they'd grown themselves. As we talked, I found myself studying their faces, the easy way they moved together, the life they had built in this place that once belonged to Walter and me. "We've been thinking," Nancy said as we finished our meal. "This place is too big for just the 2 of us most of the time." Richard nodded. "We were wondering if you might consider an arrangement, a standing reservation, so to speak." "What kind of arrangement?" I asked. "The east wing, the one with the separate entrance and the small kitchenette," Nancy explained. "We hardly use it. We thought perhaps you might like to have it as your own space, to come and go as you please." I looked at them, these people who had unwittingly purchased my stolen home, who owed me nothing yet offered everything. "We know it's not the same as having your cabin back," Richard added, "but this place clearly means something to you, and frankly, we've come to value your company." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. I don't know what to say. Nancy reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Say you'll think about it. The room will be here whenever you need it." That night, as I drove back to Burlington, I thought about their offer, about Madison and the house near Lauren, about Henry's new job and the possibility of starting fresh. The road stretched before me, dark except for my headlights illuminating the way forward. When I reached my apartment, there was a message waiting on my answering machine. Lauren's voice, excited. "Mom, the house on our street just dropped in price. It's perfect for you. Call me back." I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at the few possessions I'd managed to reclaim. A photo of Walter and me on our 30th anniversary, a quilt my mother had made, the letter Walter had left in the safe deposit box. So little remained of our life together, yet somehow it was enough. The next morning I called Lauren. "Tell me more about this house," I said. 2 months later, I stood in an empty living room in Madison, Wisconsin. Sunlight streamed through large windows, casting patterns on hardwood floors that needed refinishing. The kitchen was outdated, the bathroom in need of new fixtures. But through the back door, a garden waited, overgrown but full of potential. Lauren stood beside me, her arm linked through mine. "Well, what do you think?" "It needs work," I said, looking around at the blank canvas before me. "Yes," she agreed, "but so do all the best things in life." I signed the papers that afternoon. As I wrote my name, my real signature, not the forged one Theodore had used to steal my life, I felt something shift inside me. A closing of one chapter, the opening of another. Emily and Jason helped me move in, carrying boxes and arguing good-naturedly about where furniture should go. Henry arrived a week later, just in time to help paint the living room a warm shade of yellow that reminded me of the first light of morning on Lake Champlain. "I spoke to Richard and Nancy yesterday," he told me as we worked side by side, the scent of fresh paint filling the air. "They've set up the East Wing for you, whenever you're ready to visit." I nodded, brushing a strand of gray hair from my face. "I'll go back in the fall, I think, when the leaves are changing." The summer passed in a blur of renovation and reconnection. I planted a garden with vegetables and flowers, including a border of daisies that reminded me of Nancy's thoughtful gesture. Lauren and I cooked Sunday dinners together, recreating recipes my mother had taught me, that I had taught her. Emily, my granddaughter, sat at the kitchen counter watching us, absorbing the rhythms and traditions that had skipped a generation. Jason, 12 and on the cusp of adolescence, was harder to reach. He had been 7 when Theodore's deception began, old enough to feel the absence of his grandmother but too young to understand the complex web of lies that caused it. He kept his distance, polite but wary, as if afraid I might disappear again. One rainy afternoon in August, I found him sitting on my back porch, watching the downpour with a contemplative expression that reminded me so much of Walter that my breath caught. "May I join you?" I asked. He shrugged, the universal teenage signal for reluctant permission. I sat beside him on the porch swing, listening to the rain drum against the roof. "Mom says you didn't really leave," he said after a long silence, "that it was all a lie." "That's right," I confirmed. "I would never have left you all willingly." He picked at a loose thread on his jeans, not looking at me. "But you're here now. You're not going back to that cabin." Understanding dawned. He was afraid I would choose the past over the present, the memories of Walter over the living family before me. "The cabin is part of my history," I said carefully. "I'll visit sometimes to remember, but this," I gestured to the house behind us, to the neighborhood where his family lived, "this is my home now, where my family is." He nodded, still not meeting my eyes, but he stayed on the porch with me until the rain stopped, and when dinner time came, he sat next to me at the table. Small steps toward healing. In September, Henry moved into a house just 10 minutes away. The three of us, me, Lauren, and Henry, found ourselves creating new traditions. Friday night movies at my house, Saturday morning farmers market trips, Sunday dinners that stretched into the evening with conversation and laughter filling the rooms that had once seemed so empty. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I would catch one of them looking at me with an expression of wonder, as if they couldn't quite believe I was really there, as if I might fade away like a dream upon waking. In those moments, I made sure to reach out, a touch on the arm, a squeeze of the hand, physical reassurance that I was real, present, staying. October brought crisp air and turning leaves. True to my word, I drove back to Burlington to the cabin on Lake Champlain. Richard and Nancy welcomed me with open arms and a room prepared just as they had promised. Fresh linens on the bed, a vase of late-season flowers on the dresser, a small refrigerator stocked with essentials. "We weren't sure when you'd come," Nancy admitted as she showed me the space, "but we wanted it to be ready." That evening, I sat on the dock in one of the Adirondack chairs, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of fire. The air was sharp with the scent of autumn, of endings and beginnings. I thought about Walter, about the life we had shared here, about the secrets we had kept from each other. "I wish you could see them now," I whispered, as if he might hear me across the veil that separates the living from the dead. "Our children, our grandchildren, they're healing, Walter. We all are." A loon called across the water, its mournful cry echoing against the hills. I closed my eyes and listened, really listened to the sounds around me. The gentle lap of water against the dock, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of geese heading south. When I opened my eyes again, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. I stayed until the cold drove me inside, to the warmth of the cabin that was no longer mine, but would always be part of me. The next morning, I woke early and walked the perimeter of the property. The land sloped gently down to the lake, covered in pine needles that cushioned my steps. At the edge of the woods, I found the tree where Walter and I had carved our initials decades ago, now grown over and barely visible. I traced the faded marks with my fingertip, feeling the rough bark beneath my skin. Richard found me there, a steaming mug of coffee in each hand. "Nancy thought you might need this," he said, offering one to me. We stood in companionable silence, sipping our coffee as the morning mist rose from the lake. "You know," he said eventually, "when we bought this place, it felt like it had a history. A good one." He glanced at me. "That was you and Walter, wasn't it? The love you put into this land." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "We feel it," he continued, "like we're caretakers more than owners, continuing something important." Before I left that afternoon, Nancy pressed a small wooden box into my hands. "We found this when we were renovating the boathouse," she explained. "It has your name on it." The box was simple pine, weathered by years of lake air. On the lid, carved in Walter's distinctive hand, was my name, Vivian. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of smooth stones, lake stones, the kind Walter and I used to collect on walks along the shore. Each one had a date etched into it, marking anniversaries, birthdays, milestones in our life together. The last stone was dated just weeks before Theodore's deception began. "Thank you," I whispered, closing the box carefully. "There's a letter, too," Nancy said softly, "at the bottom." Beneath the stones lay an envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Walter's handwriting strong and clear, not yet affected by illness. "My dearest Vivian, by the time you find this, our story will have many more chapters. Each stone represents a moment when I looked at you and thought, how lucky am I to share this life with her? I hope there will be many more stones to add in the years to come. All my love, Walter." I drove back to Madison the next day, the wooden box beside me on the passenger seat. The highway stretched before me, carrying me away from the past and toward the future. As the miles passed, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here, the betrayal, the loss, the rediscovery of family and self. Theodore's trial was set for spring. Caroline had prepared me for what would come, the testimony I would give, the evidence that would be presented, the likelihood that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. Justice, cold and precise, but not healing. That had to come from within. When I arrived home, Emily was waiting on the front porch, a book open on her lap. She looked up as I pulled into the driveway, her face breaking into a smile that warmed me more than any summer day. "Grandma, she called, setting the book aside and running to meet me. "Did you bring rocks from the lake? You promised." I laughed, remembering our conversation before I left. "I did indeed," I said, reaching into my pocket for the smooth stones I had collected from the shore. One for each of us. Later, as we sat at my kitchen table painting the stones, Emily's with intricate patterns, mine with simple words like courage and family, I watched her bent head, the serious concentration on her young face, 15 years old, on the cusp of womanhood, with her whole life stretching before her. "Grandma," she said without looking up from her work, "will you tell me about Grandpa? The real stories, not just the nice ones." I set down my paintbrush, studying her profile. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said simply. "The good and the bad, how you fell in love, how you stayed together even when it was hard." She finally looked up, her eyes, so like Henry's, so like Raymond's, though she would never know it, meeting mine directly. "I want to understand." And so I told her. About meeting Walter at 19, about our early struggles and triumphs, about the mistake I made with Raymond and the child that resulted, her father, about Walter's forgiveness and love, his acceptance of Henry as his own, about the good years at the cabin and the difficult ones toward the end. He wasn't perfect, I concluded as twilight gathered outside the windows. Neither was I, but we loved each other through it all. Emily was quiet for a long moment, considering my words. "And this man, Theodore, did he love you too?" The question caught me off guard. "I think," I said slowly, "he thought he did. But real love doesn't destroy. It builds, even when it's difficult." She nodded, returning to her stone painting. "I'm glad you're here now," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Where you belong." Winter came to Madison with a fierceness I had forgotten, having spent so many years in the milder climate of Vermont. Snow piled in drifts against my windows, and the wind howled around the eaves of my little house. But inside was warmth. The warmth of family dinners, of movie nights with my grandchildren, of long conversations with Henry and Lauren as we continued to rebuild the bonds that had been stretched thin by deception. Christmas approached, the first we would celebrate together in 4 years. Lauren suggested we host it at my house, neutral territory she called it, with a smile that acknowledged the healing still in progress. "Nothing fancy," she assured me, "just family." But as the day drew nearer, I found myself filled with a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. I baked cookies using my mother's recipes, strung lights around the living room, set up a small tree in the corner by the window. I wrapped presents with care, choosing each gift thoughtfully. Books for Emily, a new fishing rod for Jason, a nod to the grandfather he barely remembered, a silk scarf for Lauren in her favorite shade of blue. For Henry, I hesitated. What do you give the son you almost lost? The son who carries the burden of a secret identity, who tried to protect his father at great cost to himself. In the end, I gave him Walter's watch, the one possession of my husband's I had managed to keep. It wasn't valuable in monetary terms, just a simple timepiece with a worn leather band. But Walter had worn it every day, winding it each morning with a ritual precision that marked the beginning of his day. When Henry opened the small box on Christmas morning, his eyes filled with tears. "Dad's watch," he whispered, running his finger over the scratched face. I remember him winding it every morning at the breakfast table. "He would want you to have it," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "He was so proud of you, Henry. Always." The day passed in a blur of food and laughter, of presents and stories and the simple joy of being together. As evening fell, we gathered in the living room, the tree lights casting a warm glow over our faces. Jason, to everyone's surprise, asked if I would tell a story about Walter. a Christmas memory from before he was born. I told them about the year Walter and I were snowbound at the cabin, how we had made a feast from what we could find in the pantry, how we had danced to old records as the storm raged outside, how it had been one of our happiest Christmases, despite, or perhaps because of, its simplicity. "That's what I want," Lauren said when I finished. "Not the being snowbound part, but that feeling of being exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly who you're supposed to be with." I looked around at my family. My daughter with strands of silver in her dark hair, my son winding his father's watch with the same careful motion Walter had used, my grandchildren leaning against each other on the couch, half asleep after the excitement of the day. This was where I was supposed to be. These were the people I was supposed to be with. The trial came in April, when the first daffodils were pushing through the soil in my garden. I flew back to Burlington with Henry beside me, his solid presence a comfort as we faced what was to come. Theodore looked older than I remembered, diminished somehow by the orange jumpsuit and the handcuffs that bound his wrists. His eyes, when they met mine across the courtroom, showed no remorse, only a cold calculation that sent a shiver down my spine. For 3 days, I testified about the deception, how Theodore had isolated me, forged my signature, sold my properties, and spread the lie of my abandonment, and later, my death. I spoke of Walter's confusion in his final months, of the letter he had left in the safe deposit box, of the recordings found in the cabin desk that captured Theodore's confession. Henry testified about the blackmail, about Theodore's threats to reveal the truth about his parentage, about the impossible choice he had been forced to make between protecting his father's feelings and stopping Theodore's theft. Through it all, Theodore sat impassive, his face a mask of indifference. He declined to testify in his own defense, a strategy his attorneys had advised to minimize his exposure to cross-examination. On the final day, as we waited for the jury to return, Caroline sat with us in a small conference room at the courthouse. "No matter what happens," she said, her eyes moving between Henry and me, "you've already won the most important battle. You've reclaimed your truth, your family." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. We stood as they filed back into the courtroom, 12 ordinary people who held the power to deliver justice. The foreman, a retired school teacher with kind eyes, handed the verdict to the judge. "On the count of fraud in the first degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of forgery, how do you find?" "Guilty." Count after count, the answer was the same. Theodore showed no reaction, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the courtroom walls. When the judge announced the sentence, 20 years without possibility of parole, a murmur ran through the courtroom. At 67, it was effectively a life sentence. As the bailiffs led Theodore away, he turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine one last time. In that moment, I saw not the calculated criminal who had stolen my life, but a lonely old man who had never understood the difference between possession and love. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones, hungry for a statement from the woman who had been declared dead, only to return and bring her betrayer to justice. Caroline fielded most of the questions, her responses professional and measured. When one reporter asked me directly how it felt to see Theodore sentenced, I paused, considering my words carefully. "Justice was served today," I said finally. But the real victory happened months ago when I found my way back to my family, when we began to rebuild what was broken. I looked at Henry, standing tall beside me. Some things once stolen can never be replaced, but others can be recreated, stronger than before. That evening, Richard and Nancy hosted a small gathering at the cabin, a celebration of closure, of justice served, of life continuing. Lauren had flown in for the verdict, and she joined us along with Caroline and a few close friends who had stood by us through the ordeal. As twilight fell, I walked down to the dock alone, needing a moment of quiet reflection. The lake was calm, mirroring the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. I thought about Walter, about the life we had shared, about the secrets we had kept, and the love that had sustained us despite them. "We did it, Walter," I whispered to the gentle waves. "We found the truth. We protected our family." A loon called in the distance, its haunting cry echoing across the water. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of my own breathing, to the soft lapping of water against the dock posts, to the faint murmur of conversation from the cabin behind me. When I opened my eyes, Henry was walking toward me, 2 glasses of wine in his hands. He offered one to me silently, then stood beside me, his gaze on the darkening lake. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot today," he said after a while, "about what he would make of all this." I sipped my wine, considering. "I think he would be sad about Theodore. They were friends for so long." Henry nodded, "But proud of us, for finding the truth, for staying together." "Yes," I agreed. "Proud of us for that." We stood in companionable silence, watching as the last light faded from the sky, as the stars emerged in their full glory, as the moon cast a silver path across the water. "Mom," Henry said eventually, his voice quiet but firm, "I want you to know something. I never blamed you. For Raymond, for any of it. You did the best you could with an impossible situation." I turned to look at him, this son of my heart, if not my husband's blood. In the moonlight, I could see Walter in the set of his jaw, in the thoughtful furrow of his brow, but I could also see Raymond in the shape of his eyes, in the way he held himself, and I could see myself, in his resilience, in his capacity for forgiveness, in his unwavering loyalty to family. "Thank you," I said simply, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Behind us, the cabin glowed with warm light, windows bright against the darkness. Laughter drifted down to us, Lauren's voice rising above the others as she recounted some story that had everyone in stitches. "We should go back," Henry said, nodding toward the cabin, "before they send a search party." As we walked up the path together, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us here, the betrayal, the loss, the rediscovery of what matters most. I thought about Theodore, sitting alone in a prison cell, and felt a complex mixture of justice, satisfied, and sorrow for a life so twisted by obsession. Most of all, I thought about the future stretching before us, not perfect, not unmarked by the scars of the past, but rich with possibility. My little house in Madison with its garden of daisies, Sunday dinners with Lauren and her family, fishing trips with Henry and Jason, conversations with Emily about books and life, and the complex nature of love. The cabin would always be part of my story, a chapter in the ongoing narrative of my life, but it was no longer my home. Home, I had learned, was not a place, but a feeling. The feeling of being exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly who you're supposed to be with. As we reached the cabin door, Henry paused, his hand on the knob. "Ready?" he asked, a question that seemed to encompass far more than just entering a room. I looked at my son, at the cabin beyond him filled with people who cared for us, at the night sky above us scattered with stars. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." Have you ever discovered that what you thought was the end of your story was actually just the beginning of a new chapter? Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our deepest losses. A year after Theodore's conviction, I celebrated my 70th birthday in my garden in Madison. The daisies were in full bloom, their white petals bright against the green of new grass. Lauren had arranged everything, a long table under the maple tree, chairs for everyone, fairy lights strung from branch to branch that would twinkle as evening fell. "Too much?" she asked as she showed me the setup that morning. "I can scale it back if you prefer." I shook my head, touched by her thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," I assured her. "Just perfect." Guests began arriving at 4, Henry with a bouquet of wildflowers, Emily and Jason carrying carefully wrapped packages, Richard and Nancy, who had flown in from Burlington for the occasion. Caroline came with her husband, a quiet man who taught history at the local college. Neighbors I had come to know over the past year, friends from my book club, even my doctor and his wife, who had become more than just medical advisors during my adjustment to a new city. As I moved among them, accepting birthday wishes and hugs, I marveled at how full my life had become. From the isolation of those years when Theodore had cut me off from the world to this, a garden overflowing, with people who cared for me, who knew my story and loved me, not despite it, but because of the strength it had revealed. Lauren called for everyone's attention as the sun began to set. "Before we bring out the cake," she announced, "we have something special for Mom." Henry stepped forward, carrying what looked like a large picture frame covered with a cloth. "This is from all of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to remind you of how far we've come." He removed the cloth to reveal not a picture, but a shadow box. Inside, arranged with artistic precision, were objects that told the story of our family's journey. A small stone from Lake Champlain, a pressed daisy, Walter's letter from the safe deposit box, carefully preserved. A photo of the cabin, another of my new house in Madison, and in the center, a family portrait taken at Christmas, all of us together around my tree. At the bottom, engraved on a small brass plate, were the words, "The Matthews Family, Lost and Found." Tears blurred my vision as I looked at this tangible representation of our story, the pain and the healing, the loss and the recovery, the breaking and the mending. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's beautiful." Later, as twilight deepened into evening and the fairy lights twinkled overhead, I found myself sitting beside Nancy at the far end of the garden. The sounds of conversation and laughter drifted to us from the table where dessert was being served. "Richard and I have been talking," she said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "We're thinking of selling the cabin." I turned to look at her, surprised. "But you love it there." She nodded, a wistful smile crossing her face. "We do, but it's a lot to maintain as we get older. And honestly, after everything that happened there, with you, with Walter, with Theodore, it feels like the cabin has served its purpose in our lives." "What will you do instead?" I asked. "We're looking at places here in Madison, actually." Her eyes met mine, warm with affection. "We've come to value having you in our lives, Vivian, and this seems like a good community for the next chapter." The idea of Richard and Nancy moving to Madison, of having these unexpected friends become part of my daily life rather than occasional visitors, filled me with a quiet joy. "The cabin will find the right owners," I said, thinking of how it had come to them when they needed a fresh start. "Someone else who needs what it has to offer." Nancy reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's exactly what Richard said." As the party wound down and guests began to leave, I stood at my garden gate, accepting final birthday wishes and goodbye hugs. The night air was cool but not cold, fragrant with the scent of flowers and the promise of summer to come. Henry was the last to leave, lingering after helping to clear away the remnants of the celebration. We stood on my front porch, looking up at the star-filled sky. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, pulling me into a gentle hug. "Thank you for today," I replied, "for everything." He stepped back, his hands on my shoulders, studying my face in the porch light. "You know, you look more like yourself now than you have in years." I understood what he meant. The woman I had been before Theodore's betrayal, confident, engaged with life, surrounded by family, had returned, altered by experience but essentially intact. "I feel like myself," I admitted. Most days, anyway. After Henry left, I sat alone on my porch swing, listening to the night sounds of my neighborhood, a dog barking in the distance, the hum of air conditioners, the occasional car passing on the street, so different from the sounds of the cabin, where loons called across the water and wind rustled through pine trees. Yet both soundscapes were part of me now, the past and the present, the loss and the recovery, the breaking and the mending. All of it woven together into the fabric of a life that had proven more resilient than I could have imagined in my darkest moments. The next morning, I woke early, the house quiet after the festivities of the day before. I made coffee and carried it out to the garden, where dew sparkled on grass and flowers in the first light of day. The shadow box Henry had given me sat on my kitchen table, waiting to be hung in a place of honor. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. From the cabin on Lake Champlain to this little house in Madison. from the betrayal that had shattered my world to the healing that had put it back together in new and unexpected ways. Theodore would spend the rest of his life in prison, his obsession having cost him everything. The money he had stolen, much of it recovered, had been put into a trust for Emily and Jason's education. The properties he had sold fraudulently remained with their new owners, the courts having decided that unwinding those transactions would cause more harm than good. And Walter, my Walter, with his quiet strength and his capacity for forgiveness, was gone, but not forgotten. I saw him in Henry's thoughtful frown, in the way Lauren planned family gatherings with meticulous attention to detail, in Jason's love of fishing and Emily's artistic talent. I felt him in the wooden box of lake stones that now sat on my bedside table, in the letter he had left that assured me he had always known the truth about Henry and loved him anyway. The phone rang, interrupting my reverie. It was Caroline calling to check on me after the party. "Everything go as planned?" she asked. "Better," I assured her. "It was a perfect day." "Good. You deserve it." There was a pause, and I could hear her shuffling papers. "I have some news. The FBI found another of Theodore's accounts in Switzerland." My heart quickened. "How much?" "Just over $2 million. They're working on getting it released to you, but these things take time. $2 million. A fortune by most standards, though less than half of what Theodore had stolen. Still, it represented possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Security for my remaining years, perhaps a legacy for my grandchildren, maybe even the cabin, I said aloud, the idea taking shape as I spoke. I could buy it back. Caroline was silent for a moment. "Is that what you want, Vivian? To go back?" The question gave me pause. Did I want to return to the cabin, to the site of so much joy and so much pain? Did I want to reclaim that part of my past, or was it better to let it go, to allow it to remain a chapter concluded? "I don't know," I admitted. "I need to think about it." After we hung up, I walked through my little house, the kitchen where I baked cookies with Emily, the living room where we gathered for movie nights, the spare bedroom where Henry sometimes stayed when he worked late at the university. This place had become home in ways I hadn't expected, filled with new memories that balanced the weight of the old ones. Later that day, I called Richard and Nancy to tell them about the recovered funds, about the possibility of buying back the cabin. They listened without interruption, and when I finished, Richard spoke. "Vivian, if you want the cabin back, it's yours. We'll sell it to you for whatever you paid originally. No profit, no negotiation." Tears pricked at my eyes at their generosity. "That's not necessary," I began, but Nancy cut me off. "It is necessary. For us. We've always felt like caretakers more than owners. If you want to come home to the cabin, we want to make that possible. Home." The word echoed in my mind. Was the cabin still home? Or had home become this place in Madison, close to my family, where I had rebuilt my life from the fragments Theodore had left behind? "Let me think about it," I said finally. "This isn't a decision to make hastily." That evening, Lauren and her family came for dinner, a regular Sunday tradition that had evolved over the past year. As we sat around my dining table, I told them about the recovered funds, about Richard and Nancy's offer. "You could have the cabin back," Lauren said, her eyes wide. "After everything, you could go home." I looked at her, at Henry, who had joined us, at my grandchildren, who were listening with curious expressions. "I'm not sure the cabin is home anymore," I said slowly. "I'm not sure I want to go back." Emily, 15 and increasingly perceptive, studied my face. "Because of the bad memories?" I considered her question, trying to articulate feelings I was still sorting through myself. "Not exactly. More because I've built something new here, with all of you. Going back might mean letting go of that." Jason, usually quiet during family discussions, spoke up. "You could have both. The cabin for summers, like before, this house the rest of the time. Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying goes." I hadn't considered that possibility, that I didn't have to choose between past and present, that I could incorporate both into my future. That's actually a really good idea. Henry said, looking at his nephew with newfound respect. The best of both worlds. Over the next few weeks, I thought about it constantly. I spoke with Caroline about the legal implications, with my financial advisor about the practicalities. I walked through my house in Madison, trying to imagine dividing my time between here and the cabin. I called Richard and Nancy, who were proceeding with their plans to relocate to Madison regardless of my decision. In the end, it was a dream that decided me. A dream so vivid that I woke with tears on my face and Walter's name on my lips. In the dream, we were at the cabin, sitting on the dock as we had done countless times. The lake was mirror smooth, reflecting a sky filled with stars. Walter turned to me, his face more clearly defined than it had been in my dreams since his death. "The cabin will always be part of us," he said, his voice as real as if he sat beside me. "But it's not where you belong now." I woke with absolute certainty. The cabin belonged to my past, a treasured, sacred past that I would always carry with me. But my future lay here in Madison, with the family I had reclaimed, with the life I had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. I called Richard and Nancy that morning. "I've made my decision," I told them. "I won't be buying back the cabin." There was a pause, then Nancy's voice, gentle with understanding. "Are you sure, Vivian?" "I'm sure," I said, and as I spoke the words, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The cabin was Walter's and mine. It was our chapter. Now it's yours, and someday it will belong to someone else. That's as it should be. "We'll take good care of it," Richard promised, "for as long as it's ours." "I know you will," I said, and meant it. With the recovered funds, I established a trust for Emily and Jason's education, made donations to causes Walter had supported, and set aside enough to ensure my own security. The rest I invested in a small business venture Henry had been considering, a consulting firm that would allow him to use his economic expertise to help nonprofits maximize their impact. "Are you sure?" he asked when I presented him with the proposal. "This is your money, Mom. Your future." "Our future," I corrected him. "Family takes care of family." Richard and Nancy sold the cabin the following spring to a young couple with 2 small children. Before the new owners took possession, they invited me for one last visit, a chance to say goodbye to the place that had been so central to my life for so many years. I walked through the room slowly, touching door frames, looking out windows at views I had memorized decades ago. So much had happened within these walls: love and laughter, arguments and reconciliations, betrayal and deception, healing and forgiveness. On my last morning, I woke before dawn and made my way down to the dock. The lake was shrouded in mist, the opposite shore invisible. I sat in one of the Adirondack chairs, wrapped in a blanket against the early spring chill, and watched as the sun rose, burning away the fog to reveal the mountains beyond. "Goodbye, Walter," I whispered to the brightening sky. "Goodbye to what we were here." As I turned to walk back to the cabin, I noticed something at the edge of the dock, a small, smooth stone that hadn't been there the night before. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm. It was warm despite the cool morning air, as if it had absorbed the first rays of sunlight. I slipped the stone into my pocket, a final memento of this place that had shaped so much of my life. Then I walked up the path to the cabin, where Richard and Nancy waited to drive me to the airport, back to Madison, back to the life I had chosen. Today, I am 71 years old. I live in my little house in Madison with its garden of daisies and its Sunday family dinners. Richard and Nancy have settled into a condo just 10 minutes away, becoming part of our extended family circle. Henry's consulting firm is thriving, Lauren has returned to teaching, and my grandchildren are growing into thoughtful, compassionate young adults. The stone from the dock sits on my bedside table, alongside Walter's watch and the wooden box of dated lake stones. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I hold it in my hand, feeling its smooth contours, its solid weight. It reminds me of where I've been, of what I've survived, of the strength I didn't know I possessed until it was tested. Theodore remains in prison, his appeals exhausted. I think of him sometimes, this man who thought he could possess my life by stealing it. I wonder if he understands, even now, that what he took, properties, money, years, were just things. The essence of who I am, the love that binds me to my family, the memories that shape my identity, these were always beyond his reach. The cabin is no longer mine, but the memories, the real ones, not the false narrative Theodore created, those will always belong to me. And now, finally, I can share them freely, weaving them into the new story I am creating with each day that passes. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from broken pieces, know that you're not alone. Sometimes the most beautiful mosaics are made from shattered glass, and sometimes what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of a different, equally meaningful chapter.